Hi, my name is Peter Lee. I'm doing a group paper on the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, TMI-2. It is for my capstone class at Thomas Edison State College. I'll be covering what happened after the accident, the aftermath. So let's get started. One of the big things that happened after the accident was people wanted to know how much radiation was released from the accident. They wanted to know how it's going to affect the people around them and how it's going to affect the environment. So what the governing body did, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, as well as the 3 Mile Island plant itself, they set up TLDs, air monitoring stations, and flew planes within a mile radius to catch how much radiation was released and what type of radiation was released. This was important because there was quite a lot of people living near the station. This is a 10-mile representation and a 20-mile representation of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. So what they found out after about a month was that the radioactivity that was released in the environment was limited to the atmosphere. It was mainly a noble gas, primarily xenon, about 2.4 million to 13 million curies, and a small fraction of the in-core iodine, about 13 to 16 curies. What does this mean? The main radioactive release to the atmosphere was xenon, which is a noble gas. Noble gases don't like to react with other elements, and radioactive xenon will release beta particles as it decays, which is bad for humans if they are in close contact or if it's ingested, but it has a short half-life. Xenon 133 has a half-life of about 5.2 days, which means that half the inventory of the radioactive iodine that was released, that was Xenon 133, would decay away in about 5.2 days, and Xenon 135 would decay away in about 9.1 hours. The main isotope of concern was iodine 131, which has a half-life of about 8 days, but it decays into xenon 131. Iodine 131 and xenon 131 both emit beta particles, which can be harmful if ingested. But the reason that xenon 131 was bad was because it was a stable isotope. It has a half-life of about 16 million years, so it's very stable, and if you ingested it, it can move up to the thyroid and cause cancer. But only about 15 to 16 curies was actually released of iodine 131. As you can see through this table, most of the radioactive elements released was xenon 133 and xenon 135, about 63% and 12%, which again has short half-lives, which was good. As you can see, the exposure rate drastically reduced over time. This is over a 2-week period taken from an airplane flying about 500 feet above sea level in a 1-mile radius around the plant. So how much radiation did people receive? There were about 2.16 million people living within a 50-mile radius of the site. Their cumulative dosage, which was everybody put together, was about 3,300 person rem. This averaged out to about 1.5 millirem per person, with a maximum theoretical of less than 100 millirem. This was what they calculated after getting all that data from the TLDs, the flights, the air monitoring equipment. According to the NRC, an average chest ray is about 6 millirem. Transatlantic flight is about 2.5 millirem. A daily exposure is a little less than 1 millirem, so it was not very much. From there, they extrapolated that the case of fatal cancer is less than 1 out of the 2.1 million people, and if you added the fatal cancer to non-fatal cancer, there was maybe a 1.5 people may get cancer out of the 2.1 million people. If someone received the maximum dosage, the maximum theoretical dosage of 100 millirem, they had a chance of 1 in 100,000 additional chance over their lifetime to get cancer, and if they got the 1.5 millirem, they had 1 in 5 million chance. over the course of their lifetime to get cancer. And different agencies like the EPA, Audubon Society, and a bunch of other conducted tests over the years, and they verified that there was a very low level of radiation to the people and to the environment. The low dosage is attributed because most of the radioactive material was contained within the reactor containment building. The next section that I wanted to talk about was cleanup. Most of the damage had happened inside the reactor and containment building, but there had been some contamination outside the building, like the vented noble gases and some spilling and overflow inside containment buildings and the Unit 2 auxiliary building. So one of the first things they noticed was that the filters that were supposed to clean out the vented noble gases and iodine-131 was not working. They had to clean out the traps and bring in more charcoal filters to fix this problem. So when the accident first happened, there was about 0.5 to 2 curies a day of iodine-131 being detected, but because of the actions that they took, they were able to bring it down to about 1 microcurie a day, which was close to what was the average specific. The next thing they worried about was the contaminated water. There was water from overfill, and so they needed to figure out what was highly radioactive, what was medium, and what was low, because they would take different actions for that. There was nothing they could really do inside the reactor containment building because it was still an ongoing casualty, and in reality they wouldn't be able to even go inside the reactor containment building for at least a year after accident happened. So this is a table showing the iodine release because the filters weren't working. As you can see, it was pretty high, about 2 to 0.5 curies a day. But as they changed out the filters and brought in more charcoal filters, it drastically dropped off. So by the beginning of May, they were down to the levels that they wanted to be. Next, they needed to figure out the water situation. Again, this is a table showing where they thought the water was coming from, how it came out, and how much was inside the building. They expected about almost 250,000 gallons of highly contaminated water inside the reactor building. There was water they had to worry about that were outside the building itself, and how to take care of that. So this is a good overview of where they thought the contaminated water was. As you can see, this is the reactor, this is auxiliary building 2, and that was their main concern on how to clean up the water, and that's what they did within the first month, first year. So this is a timeline of the cleanup efforts at 3 Mile Island. This is from the NRC fact sheet. So approximate on July 1980, which was about a year after, they were able to vent out about 43,000 curies of krypton so they can actually get into the reactor building. And later that month, they were actually able to do their first manned entry to see what was going on inside the reactor containment building. From there, from the data that they gained, they built an action plan, and it took them a few years. It wasn't until July 1984 that they were actually able to start decontamination and cleaning of the reactor containment building. In 1984, the reactor vessel head was removed around July, and then around October of 1985, the initial defueling of the reactor happened. Much of the debris was taken off-site to Idaho Falls National Laboratory, and over the course of 5 years, and while they were doing the defueling, they were able to see how much damage was actually caused inside the reactor, and it was a lot more than they had thought. By about 1990, defueling was done. About 1993, they were able to get themselves into a position where it was a long-term monitoring of TMI-2, and they were looking at decommissioning of TMI-2 the same time that TMI-1, which was the other nuclear unit there, was going to be decommissioned. That was going to happen in 2014. They actually extended the license of TMI-1 to about 2034, so TMI-2 is not going to be decommissioned until about 2034, at the same time as TMI-1. The process of the cleanup efforts took almost $1 billion to complete, and they had to use robots. They had to use a lot of different innovative ways to figure out how much radioactivity was in there, where it was at, and how to remove it. Here's an example of workers performing defueling inside the plant. As you can see, they are in a lot of protective gear because there was a lot of contamination. A lot of fuel had melted. So this is a picture of the damage within the core itself. It was a lot more than they had thought, and a lot more than fuel had melted. The next part I wanted to cover was some of the policy and regulatory changes made by the nuclear power industry and the NRC after 3 Mile Island. One of the main things was that there was a change in plant design so that some of the problems that they had that caused 3 Mile Island nuclear incident to happen would be fixed. They looked at the pressure relief valves. They looked at the auxiliary feed water system. They looked at instrumentation and how people interacted with these equipments. One of the big things that happened within the 3 Mile Island accident was that there were so many instrumentation and indications all over the place that the operators were not able to get all the information they needed to do. They needed to evaluate what was going on within the plant, and that contributed a large factor into how severe the problem became. Another thing that came out of 3 Mile Island was that there was an increase in the NRC's resident inspector program. This was a pilot program before 3 Mile Island, but after 3 Mile Island, they were able to receive funding where they were able to provide 2 inspectors per plant that would be there 24/7, providing input and oversight that could report back to the NRC. This created a much more robust NRC that was able to take care of the problems at all these different plants and actually have first-hand knowledge of what was going on. Other things that came out of the 3 Mile accident was the expansion of performance-oriented as well as safety-oriented inspections. They changed their risk management to see what was wrong with plants, as well as using computers to do more research and figure out, oh, this is needed or this is too much. There was the establishment of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. That was kind of the police force within the nuclear industry, and they can act as an intermediary between the NRC and other government agencies. Another large thing that came out of the 3 Mile Island accident was the creation of New Reg 0654. It was the Radiological Emergency Response Plans and Preparedness in Support of Nuclear Power Plants. This was basically the public safety preparedness plan that each plant, each state, each federal level would have so that they knew what they were doing in case of a major nuclear accident. Inside the new reg were definitions, terminology, but the basic idea was to standardize everything so that each plant would have a standardized way of preparing for an emergency. For example, this shows the reactor site and the plume travel, and then it would show this would be considered emergency planning zone. Within a 10-mile radius, this would be like within a 50-mile radius. So if everything was standardized, then it would be much more structured in the way that they could handle these emergencies. Also within the new reg, there were many different types of guidelines within it, covering from organizational control to public education to planning standards. This was a very extensive new reg that covered many different aspects of a nuclear accident. Another important part of the new reg was that it listed if you had an emergency, these are what was expected of the licensee, what was expected of local and state authorities. There were multiple examples and multiple categories, and they also listed out if this happens, then you need to go follow these steps. So there was a clear guideline on what to do in case of an emergency. This evolved into what we have now, emergency planning for the 3 Mile Island area, 2015 to 2016. This is just one of the things that reactor plants are now mandated to do. It provides emergency planning actions to the public, emergency alert systems. If they sounded a siren, what it means to the residents. It provides a general idea of where the 10-mile radius would be. It had lists of, if you wanted more information, where it is. Also within it were escape routes and what to do in case of an emergency. What to do in case. Also, within the new reg were guidelines for drills that you needed to do as a reactor plant, guidelines on when you had to do drills with the state level and the federal level, inspection criteria. So this new reg provided a huge amount of guidance and regulatory changes within the nuclear industry itself on what to do in case of an emergency and so on. The next thing I want to talk about is the effects of the 3 Mile Island accident. After the accident, there were many commissions formed, some by Jimmy Carter, who was president at that time. One of them was the Kemeny Commission. The Kemeny Commission changed the way that the NRC was run, and they would have more regulatory power and much more guidelines on how to run reactor plants. Another commission that happened was the Rogovin Commission. They found that even though the accident itself only did a small dose of radiation to the environment and the people around them, there was a disconnect between nuclear power and public opinion. The Rogovin Commission was a big wake-up call to the nuclear industry that they need to change the way that they're doing things and get on the good side of public opinion. The next thing we want to talk about is public opinion. After the accident, there was a lot of fear for the nuclear industry and a sense of dread that another accident would happen. The Washington Post did a poll of 934 people of residents near the 3 Mile Island accident, and they found that the ardent supporters were still there, but there had been a shift from people that were not as familiar with nuclear power to becoming not so much in support of nuclear power. The people that had already opposed nuclear power were now even more galvanized against it. The NRC would focus on regulation and safety. They would focus on training of the operator. They would focus on how the plant was laid out so that an accident like this would not happen. One of the big problems they found, and the lessons learned from 3 Mile Island, was that indications, instrumentation were scattered all over the control room. The industry standard had gone from about 3,000 indicators to over 7,000 indicators within the control room, and they were not all grouped together, they were spread out. So this caused operators not to have a good idea of what was going on. So some of the changes that the NRC would make would be better training of operators. They would be focused on symptoms and early detection of accidents, but to do that they needed to change the way that the control room was laid out. They decided to put all the instrumentations much closer together in an orderly fashion. They would change the way that alarms work so that there would be some semblance on if this alarm went off, it would mean that there might be this type of problem. With this type of changes to the control room and to the operators, costs went up. Many more people had to be hired within the reactor plant itself. From, as you can see on this graph, in 1975 to 1979, a reactor would have about 241 staff. But by 1980 to 1984, it had doubled, or almost doubled, to 426. By the 1990s, it was at 695, and by 1995, it was over 900 people. Much of the staffing increases happened because of the 3 Mile Island accident, and this caused an increase in how much it costs to run a nuclear reactor. Also, the average construction cost of reactors tripled from 1975 to 1995. This was a big hit, again, to the nuclear industry, and it had a lot to do with the regulations that came from the 3 Mile Island accident and the way that the NRC was run after the 3 Mile Island accident. Nuclear power had already been a little bit on the decline by 1975, but by 1979, after the 3 Mile Island accident, there were no new orders for reactors. There was no new construction permits until about 2012, and many projects were canceled after the 3 Mile Island accident. About 120 projects were canceled, abandoned, or construction stopped. The nuclear power industry is currently in a good position. There are plants being built. They have a high record of safety. The changes made after the 3 Mile Island accident, the way that the control room was changed, the way that operators are trained, the way that safety was a major concern, and all the regulations that the NRC provided has created a safer industry. These are my references for this PowerPoint, mostly from the new regs from the NRC website. There also included a couple of consulting firms that provided reports to various government agencies included as well. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.